Welcome, everybody, to the Deconstructor of Fun podcast. I'm your host, Mishka Katkoff, and today I'm honored to have Seth Sivak on the podcast. Seth, welcome.
Yeah, excited to do this.
Well, Seth, I'll just go through your career quickly so that you don't have to, but please add some color. So you started off as a gameplay engineer at Conduit Labs that was acquired by Zynga in the early boom of Facebook games. You rose to an executive producer status at Zynga, then left Zynga, founded Proletariat Inc., stayed in the trenches of about a decade, and then Proletariat was acquired by Blizzard, where you served as head of Boston studio for World of Warcraft, the t-shirt that you are wearing at the moment. And currently, you are doing what most executives do when they leave high-level positions for 1 to 2 years due to obvious reasons, consulting and advising, as well as writing the Boss Battles blog about facing the hard challenges in leadership, product, and entrepreneurship. Seth, what did I miss?
No, that's right. The only thing I would say is I didn't technically leave Zynga on my own choice. That was they actually did a round of layoffs where they closed the Boston studio. We were about 65 people at the time, and it was really interesting. It was like we had actually just hired. We had like 3 or 4 new product managers that we hired that were in San Francisco getting trained, and they closed the studio. So I had to call those people. And so I was one of the one of the most senior leaders at the Blizzard or at the Zynga Boston studio, and so I was responsible for actually doing a lot of the phone calls to people who didn't come in that day. And we had brand new hires that were like at home getting furniture delivered, and I had to call them and be like, "Hey, come get your laptop."
That's so brutal.
Yeah, and they did. This was across the board. I mean, in 2012, they did like a huge round of layoffs. They closed a bunch of the satellite studios, and this was like 9 months after the IPO. And so it was when the floor was really starting to fall out of Facebook games, right? And and it was like Zynga had not made the strong pivot to mobile. I was working on a mobile project at the time inside of Zynga, but yeah, and then we basically for the next week or two, I spent a ton of time with the members of the Zynga Boston team, helping with resumes and trying to connect them to places to get roles. But during that entire time, myself and the 4 other founders of Proletariat, we were also meeting every afternoon. And we were like, hey, we'd had a couple of conversations before this on maybe we should leave and go do our own thing. And it was because this, like, Heyday and Clash of Clans had just come out. And it was like, you can build mobile games with a much smaller team, because these teams inside of Zynga were getting huge. Like, they were these massive, like, behemoths to build these, like, huge games. We're like, what if the 5 of us or 4 of us left and started something, but the timing was never perfect. It was like I just got promoted, so I didn't want to leave, and then it just so happened that we had 3 months of severance, all of us, that we could stretch to be 6 months, and so we didn't pay ourselves. We basically said, if after 6 months we don't have healthcare, we'll all go get jobs. And so we were really open and honest, like meeting every day, and we fully incorporated, I think, 14 days after the layoffs, and so that's what we ended up doing.
That's awesome. I mean, it's not awesome to be let go, but most of the people, not most, I think third of the people listening to this podcast have gone through some kind of a layoff. But I like how you treated that as an opportunity rather than something else. I've been reading your blog. So that blog, is it only on LinkedIn or is it on other platforms?
It's on Substack as well, and just my own personal website. Not that anyone goes to it, but yeah. So I kind of post it in a couple of different places.
I have this quote, so I want to ask you about this. So it says, startups live or die by focus. In the early stages, it's easy to convince yourself that culture is something you'll figure out later. After the product launches, after the next round closes, after you hire just a few more people. But culture happens by design or by default. It starts forming the moment your team does. So I wanted to ask, like, is startup obsessing over culture and distracting themselves from the harder question, such as product market fit? Do you see that happening, or would you argue counter to that you have to focus on a culture first and rest comes in as a consequence almost?
Well, so I think, one of the fun challenges with this is, I think you probably know like this from your experience as well. There's plenty of there's plenty of exceptions on all sides. Like you can look at super successful companies that maybe have like not great cultures and they have to go in and retrofit and fix them later. You can look at companies that you think have great cultures that never make it, right? The team's like, jamming on all cylinders, they're creating good stuff, but it just never works. And this is a whole other conversation on like, building as many opportunities to get lucky as possible, because that's really how this works, staying alive long enough to get lucky. But I think the reality is like the decisions you're making, whether you're thinking about them intentionally or not, do impact what, I think the ways in which you would reach something like product market fit. So even making a conscious decision to not talk about culture creates culture, right? Like there's a choice there that you're making. And part of what I've been sort of thinking about and given a lot of space now that I've been out of my proletariat experience for almost 2 years is I've been able to look back at a bunch of this, and it's really interesting to see how many mistakes were made along the way, and like what I would do. I've been thinking about like if I want to go start a company again, like what would I do differently? Which I'm sure that like every entrepreneur goes through once they finish the full entrepreneurial cycle, and they think about would they want to go do it again. And so of course, like product market fit is the most important thing. Like we live in, most of us live in a capitalist system, and it's like required for this thing to stay alive. But I do think that there are decisions you make on culture, who you hire, how you pay, those kinds of things, which maybe don't necessarily seem like the chest beating, here are core values on a website, that are important for, and I don't think it takes that much time to have a conscious, thoughtful decisions on why you're doing these things.
How would you define culture?
I think about culture as two key pieces. One is a shared aspiration, and that's a combination of your like mission, vision, core values. And that's really like where are we headed? And then there's the norms and the behaviors of how you get there. And that's the norms and behaviors are often those are the unwritten rules. When people talk about like the unwritten rules of culture, like that's how do we communicate? What do we incentivize? What do we punish? Like what's not acceptable here? What is acceptable here? And that often goes beyond what people write down as what they, almost universally when I talk to teams sometimes and I hear like, hey, how's everything going? Like, what are some of your challenges? And recently I've been working with a couple of teams on the production side that just need some help and advice. And I always ask them how are you at hitting deadlines? And everyone's bad at this. And the question is like, why? Like, is it because you're not incentivizing people to hit deadlines? Are you not punishing people if they miss them? Like, what is it that is causing this issue? And all of those go into what is your culture around deadlines? Because if you don't have a team that enforces deadlines, what does that mean for you as a culture? Like, are you okay with that?
The rabbit hole that I got myself into as well as a first-time founder was reading a lot of books about culture. And that steered me away from what is the most important thing, which is the product market fit. And then also retrospectively looking at a lot on different companies that were successful that are known for good culture, for example. They start off with finding actually the product market fit, being successful, being profitably scaling, and then focusing back on culture. So my question around this is like, how do you know when your efforts are actually shaping the culture and those efforts are landing, or you're just doing this mental jousting, writing PowerPoint decks and these declarations and values and missions early on? That's kind of like for you and for LinkedIn. Today's podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer, inviting you to dive into their new first of its kind report, The State of Creative Optimization 2025 edition. It's not about how to make creatives. It's about understanding what makes users actually stop scrolling and what emotional and psychological triggers drive performance. Based on over 1 million creative variations and nearly $2.5 billion in ad spend, the insights in the report will help you develop a winning creative strategy. Check out the link in the podcast description below or go to appsflyer.com and search The State of Creative Optimization. That's appsflyer.com.
Game devs. We know that great gameplay is what players love, but integrating metagame features like challenges, progression, rewards is crucial for retention and monetization. However, coding them is a tedious and time-consuming process. That's why top studios have turned to Hero. Hero provides a complete suite of battle-tested metagame features that are quick to implement, letting you spend more time on the core gameplay experience. Ready to ship fully featured, engaging games? Check out Hero today by clicking the link below.
Yeah. I mean, the so I think making some of these decisions, especially some of the more concrete ones around things like behaviors, right? Is like, okay, like we're going to start enforcing deadlines. So what we're going to do is we feel like the right thing to do is if you hit your deadline, you can take, if you hit your Friday deadline early, you can take the rest of the day off. I'm just using that as an example. That's like not something
Yeah,
we
of
did at
course.
Proletariat. And so then I would say like check in 3 months, like, because the hitting the deadline is probably not the end goal. So I think the way I look at this is, and the way when I talk to teams about where they are, and maybe this is going into your side of it, like imagine that we're looking at 4 quadrants where the y-axis is, at the top is, we're doing the right work. At the bottom is the wrong work. And then on the x-axis on the left, we're doing work the wrong way. And on the right, we're doing work the right way. Ideal situation is you're doing the right work the right way. But in my experience, and like that's when your team is totally killing it. But that's super rare. Like almost never happens, because typically if you're starting to do the right work, it means that like you're still scaling, you're trying to figure out what you're doing, like whatever. If you're doing the right work the wrong way, you're in the like fix it mode, but at least we're doing the right work, but like we have to catch up and we're doing the right thing. If you're doing the wrong work the wrong way, you're just dead. Like you're just in, you're doing everything. The worst possible scenario, and I think this is what you're talking about, is this busyness trap where you're doing the wrong work the right way. And I think that's where people get trapped. And when you look at this, it's like, okay, well, like we're, teams hiring really well. We're making we're building stuff. We're hitting deadlines, but hitting deadlines is not the goal. Like, you still need to like make a product that makes money, or like, ship a game that gets customers happy, or whatever it is. And so the problem is like teams get really stuck on this busyness of like, okay, like look at this, we didn't miss a single deadline. We went through this entire sprint and like no one, we didn't miss a single ticket. But like, who cares if you don't actually get the outcome that you wanted, which is usually much bigger. And this is where like I think goal setting is really critical. But the you have to look at it as part of, if we're not doing the right work, like then that is step one of trying to figure out what's actually going on. Because it doesn't matter if you're not doing the right work, whether it's the right way or the wrong way, it doesn't matter. But as soon as you start to move down the path of doing the right work, you need to figure out as much as possible how to start doing it the right way. Otherwise it's just unsustainable in most cases.
Do you feel that people just have very different perception of what culture is? It's kind of like brand. Like you ask 10 brand people what brand is, and you'll get 12 descriptions.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, I agree with you. I think I look at it as a set of tools that drive behavior of like how your team's going to operate. For me, this is all about like things that are extremely actionable. Like I don't really, like I think they are tools, because the way you talk about the culture, the way you, and some of it is, I guess, a little bit of branding when you're thinking about hiring or finding customers, because culture has not, like the broader world, like human culture has slowly trended much more to people actually caring deeply about like identity alignment with the brand, with the products they buy, the companies they work for, all of those things. And I think younger and younger generations continue to have that. And so it becomes an important factor in those types of pieces. But I do think that it often gets misused. And I think partially it's misused because it is used as branding. But I think the other part is it's just like poorly executed. People are focusing on the wrong things. Like they're not making they're not putting together cultural tools that are actionable, that allow their teams to make better decisions based on this culture. Or they're not really executing, like they have these culture, they put the core values on the wall, but they don't use them. And that I think like is where I see most of the missteps. I think if a team focuses deeply on, like, it's very easy to come up with some core values. It's very hard to like use them like on a regular basis.
Well, I'll go back to the previous question. How do you know that your effort to shape the culture is actually landing? Because I think that's that's the most challenging thing that I've seen. Is like, yes, there are plenty of founders. They write these great visions, missions, the whys, you name it. But at the same time, that that is not helping the team to execute, or the team is not executing according to these lofty sentences being written. Attention app and game developers, are you ready to unlock the secrets behind the world's top performing apps and games? With Sensor Tower, you get the ultimate competitive edge, whether it's breaking into new markets, fine-tuning your UA strategies, or boosting monetization. Dive into data like never before, track global trends across app stores, analyze market-leading in-app purchase and in-app ad strategies, and benchmark your performance with real-time insight. The best part, Sensor Tower doesn't just deliver data, it helps you turn it into action. With intuitive tools and expert analysis, it's everything you need to make smarter, faster decisions. Thousands of app and game studios, from indie creators to global giants, trust Sensor Tower to help them win. So why not you? Start your free trial today at sensortower.com. That is sensortower.com. Web stores. You've seen what good looks like, but have you seen great? AppCharge is the direct-to-consumer platform backed by the likes of Supercell and built by monetization pros from Moonactive, Playtika, Huge Games, and others, people who know the difference. AppCharge powers over $500 million in transaction a year for top studios, optimizing every detail. Deeply personalized web store offers custom-made design, industry-leading monetization features, in-game payments, SDK, and more. 70% of top grossing games already have a web store, but the ones scaling fastest, they're doing it with AppCharge. Learn more at appcharge.com.
Yeah, well, I think the way we did this at Proletariat is I was sort of notorious for these really just quick Google forms that I would send to the leadership team, and I would just and so certainly every year, but I think even more often than that, probably every 6 months, I would send out like a survey to the leadership team that was basically just like, do you think your team is living up to these core values? Mm-hmm. And it was like on a scale of like, I think it was like always, sometimes, never. And so it was like very, very kind of like, only a few choices. And then we'd also ask just like, do these core values still make sense for us? Like, are they getting us where we want to go? And that was an opportunity to just talk about this and be like, okay, because you need to take a moment and actually say, okay, if things aren't working, so when everything's going well, like there's no problems. Everyone's clicking, it's not an issue. When you're doing, when you think you're doing the right work, mostly the right way, you're in a great spot. But if you're not, if it can be often hard to tell, like, are you not doing the right work or are you not doing work the right way? Which one's the problem? Like, because if you're doing the right work, but it's way too slow, then that still could be not success, right? Because like if your team can't execute the way it should, that could be an issue. And the only way to have that conversation, I think, is to look at this and be like, is this serving us? Like, one, are we living up to the values or the team, like the type of team that we want to have? Are we behaving the way we would like to behave? So is the issue that we're not behaving the right way, or are we just off on what you mentioned? Like the product market fit question is a real challenge that is somewhat separate. Like I know plenty of teams who I would say like got product market fit, scaled really well, but had disastrous cultures. Morale was terrible, huge attrition all the time. We've seen all sorts of, you see this about like the Ubers of the world and things like that.
Top companies in the world, Microsoft, right. Apple, McKinsey.
Where there are huge issues with culture, right? And so I think that there's, now some of those are like massive companies. So it's like harder to, like, there's tons of subcultures inside of that. So it's hard to slap a like label on all culture at Microsoft. But I think I think that's the way you have to look at it. So in order to judge it, it's really taking a hard look at, is the team behaving the way we want them to behave? And is that the reason why we're failing? Because it could be that like the team is behaving, not behaving the way you would like, but that's also not the reason why your company's going to go out of business.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for this naturally. That's why I'm asking you. You've spent.
That's why it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, and of course I don't have an answer for the most complex issues or more complex problem when you're talking about companies of Uber size, and how do you manage a culture? Culture meaning like, how do people behave and work at a company, which is a massive question. But on a smaller sizes, I kind of go back to like after, talking to the Kim Nordstroms of the world who wrote a lot about culture, talking a lot to a lot of executives and reading your blog, I kind of feel like the basic learnings that we got from the army was actually the most easiest to understand. And there, everybody just taught you like when you become a leader, whether you're leading a squad or a platoon or a company, you set the culture by setting an example. It's like, how do you behave? How do you work? And that will ricochet then to your direct leadership team. And then you're changing the people based on how do you want them to behave even if they're hitting the goals, but they're not working in the way that you want them to work. It's up to you. If you change that person, then you change the culture, like you enforce it or you modify to include the type of behavior that your team members are doing. So I think that's kind of easier way to grasp. And it also didn't come with presentations or decks or mugs with slogans. It's very easy. It's like if you work hard, your team will work hard. If you don't work hard, if you don't come to the office every day, your team will not come to the office every day. Very simple.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things that has drawn me to this a little bit is again having the chance to reflect on some of this stuff and really think about like what were the mistakes we made and didn't make, and really across everything, not just the. But I think in some ways the type of team you put together, the people you have. I mean, everyone talks about this, right? Like default answer is like, why was your company successful? It's like we had a team, right? And we had a great team, and in some cases that's like course, like because companies are just made up of people making decisions, like hundreds, thousands, millions of decisions over the course of however much time. And I think I similar to you, I read a ton on the subject of culture of leadership. I'm fascinated by the fact that we do a terrible job like training people to be leaders. It's sort of astounding, or managers.
We don't
in general.
do that.
It's like
we absolutely
it's incredible
don't do that.
That people just get like at companies. I've been in rooms where people are like, hey, this person's interested in being a manager, and they're like, yeah, they're not a manager. And it's like, what? How would you know? Like, and there's so few companies I've seen try to give any training or any training wheels, any guardrails as people try to go to this like thing that's not easy or intuitive. Like I'm not an expert in human psychology, but like that there's a ton here about like every little impact. You talked about this, right? Like what's the impact of leading by example? Like what's the impact of just like how, you I read all of these think pieces sometimes actually like science-backed studies on, when should leaders speak in a meeting? Should they speak first or last? What does that do? Like what, we see all this stuff when they look at different perspectives on teams, right? When you have teams with diverse backgrounds, like, socioeconomic or racial or whatever, like what does that do for those teams to solve problems? And I find a lot of this stuff really fascinating, but it is incredibly complicated to fully understand like how all these things work. I think the only way to do it that I saw was you got to just experiment, like make a change, and then 3 months later ask the leadership team, like, is this are we doing the things that we think we need to do? Because at the end of the day, it's impossible to measure all this stuff. Most of the reality in the way I look at like success for these teams is it's the decision-making capability of leadership and how confident they are in making certain decisions is what drives whether or not companies are successful. And that's like, when you think about it, like that is such a fragile thing. And you're right, it has nothing to do with like coffee mugs or t-shirts with slogans or anything like that. And I think that is all, those are, to me, are not, I mean, maybe if that is like a useful tool to you where you look at this, I mean, we did the core values for Proletariat. We like expressly tried to make them be things that weren't like, when we started the company, we were like, oh, we had these like really lofty ones that I think did not, it was like love and like, and because we want to love our game. And that to me, what we shifted to later on was like, no, like we are doubling the size of this company in 9 months during COVID. Like we need actionable tools to not have our culture just rip apart at the seams. And by culture, I mean just like how we work together. Like we liked the way the team was working. We were firing on all cylinders. We were crushing it in our mind. We were doing work the right way, or as close to the right way as we thought. And we were like, what tools do we need to not just rip this thing completely open and then force a reset? Because every new person you add in, like this is the storming, norming, forming part of team creation, which I think is very real. Like you need teams. This is why it's so valuable to find founding teams that have worked together or game teams that have made multiple games together. There's this like cohesion that is very real. And so I think what we looked for with core values was like they should be actionable. Like you should say it in a meeting and you shouldn't feel embarrassed to do it. So like one of our core values was decide fast and iterate. And it was because like we wanted people like, and people would say that in meetings and we'd say like, we should decide fast. And I think that shows that it was successful. I think if we had core values that were about like love because we want to love our games, or like, Blizzard, while I was there, was going through a transition of rewriting their core values. They had 8 core values. And a lot of them, I think, were just kind of outdated. And I think they've gotten much better. But they had ones that I think just didn't make sense. And it's, and I think it just leans into some of the culture. It's like, they had one, I think, I can't remember all of them, but there was one that was about like having fun or something. And it was like, well, yeah, like we want to have fun, but like this is a job. So how do we balance that? Like, what is that? How do we communicate that to the people here? And there's another one that was every voice matters. And so the challenge with every voice matters is like every voice does matter. You want to take feedback from everyone on the team. I think that's a great goal. But if that gets weaponized to be like, hey, I want to do this thing, you're saying my voice doesn't matter, it makes it really hard to have a huge team of people all moving in the same direction. If anyone at any time can be like, I want to go do this thing without teamwork or working together. So those are some examples of, I think, some of the challenges of doing it. But what you like, in my mind, it's these should all be tools. Like they should be tools that you are using, whether it's tools for recruiting, for hiring, or decision making. Like that's what this is for.
Interesting. So you're treating culture very much like a product. You iterate, you test, you maybe even replace, rather than treating it like gravity, something that is inescapable, invisible, intangible, right?
Absolutely, right. Like in my feeling is like, and your culture should change as your company changes, and that's both like as the company grows, like in terms of scale, number of people, all of those things. But I also feel like it should potentially shift just based on like where the industry moves, like where the market moves, like what do you need to do. But I mean, to me, like culture is not a religion. Like you should change it, you should iterate it, you should bend it to be what you need it to be. So I think like, yes, like treating it like a product is very much how we approached it at Proletariat, of just like, here was a set of documents, here is how we are going to like get the team to behave. And we're just going to and that was everything. Like we treated even our policies of just like, we're going to try this for 3 months and does it get us like our PTO policy? We're going to try it for 6 months and see if it gets us what we want in terms of behavior. And then we're going to check to see if it did. And then if not, we're going to change it.
So it's almost like it's basically a tactical tool for your strategy, because you would look at where we are as a company, where do we need to be, what do we need to do, and then culture for you is like, how are we going to do that?
Yeah, exactly. And like, and I think this is where I'll give you a tangible example of a conversation that we had to have on the leadership level that I think is like really culturally related. So, you're a small team, you're trying to make things work. I think everyone would love to have great work-life balance and then still build a small company. I don't know how to do that. So more power to the people that do, but like we worked a lot of hours early on, a lot of hours. And we made sacrifices, like personal sacrifices to make the job work. And that was just a reality. So as we were growing though, we were like, man, we're not a scrappy startup anymore. We need to grow up. We need to start depending on the type of people we want to hire as we grow, like just as a company, we don't want to feel like we're grinding people into dust, that we're working like crazy hours or whatever it is. So we had this situation where we would do this thing at the end of the week where someone would just give a shout out to, someone else on the team for doing a good job. And this was just one of the things that we struggled with culturally was recognition, people feeling like they were getting recognized. And I think that was just the nature of some of the personalities of the leadership team, where we're just not a group that would tell you're doing a great job if you're just doing your job. You really need to go above and beyond if you wanted praise. And we were just, as a leadership team, like not very driven by that personally. Not that there's anything wrong with that either way. It's just like that. Just I think members of the leadership team were more driven by shame than maybe the positive reinforcement.
Yeah, it felt fake probably for you because you understood how much work there is.
So we had this situation where someone got a shout out, got a kudos at the end of the week for basically working all weekend to get this thing in, to get like some feature in or whatever. We talked about this and we're like, do we want to reward? Like, one, it was actually really good that he got it in because, like, man, we really needed that. But two, like, should he be getting public? Do we want to create a culture where people try to be the hero and that you have to work over the weekend to get kudos here? And then if you spin that out one step further, it's like, okay, is the only way to move up to like have a, you know, to be successful at this company is to make these huge sacrifices or to do these kind of like swoop in heroic things where you're doing that. And like, this is really painful because objectively, like, we're a small company. So like occasionally we do need people to, you know, we have to push to real extremes. We have to crunch, we have to hit deadlines, you know, that are very, very hard deadlines. But then what does that communicate to everyone else if that's something we are publicly rewarding? And so this is just really complicated. Like, I don't know the right answer. And so what we talked about is we were basically like, hey, we told the whole team, we sat down with the team and we were like, listen, we think this was really good, but we want to be like not in this situation. Like, there is still going to be the cases where it's going to be necessary to do that, but this is not seen as a regular thing and it's not something we want to reward. When this happens, it means that like some mistakes occurred along the way and it's not something to be celebrated. So anyway, just to give you an example of, I think, just a really complicated cultural decision on what do you incentivize and what do you reward, and then what does that do to the behaviors of the team, like short term and long term.
So punishing or rewarding certain action is managing the culture as a product almost. So steering, putting in guardrails and steering it. But the other question that you kind of touched upon this was that the success of the company is not the same as whether the culture is good or bad. But I wanted to kind of go deeper into what is a good culture and a bad culture, because these are very much based on individuals. There might be a team full of young people, like let's say it's your founding team, and you guys pushed over the weekend to get a feature done. And that was really important because it allowed, let's say you were working for hire and that allowed you to get your, salaries paid. That might be for you good culture because you teamed up and worked really hard. And then for somebody else, it might be horrific culture of crunching.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's often a mistake that I think some of the symptoms you talk about of like these teams kind of doing things that don't feel authentic to them, or it's just things on coffee mugs, or the first thing they do is they put up a website with super lofty goals, is I think they try to project what they think other people want them to be, like what they think a good game studio would be or a good creative culture would be, because they went and read Creativity Inc., or something like that. And so they haven't, and even though if you read that book and you think about it, like the culture at Pixar was very bad, like they had massive issues, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's, I think some of the things are great. Like brain trust is an amazing idea, like being very open and direct with your feedback, like a lot of great ideas in there. But I think when you think about the fact that I think the culture, what makes a good culture is really about the stakeholders. So ultimately it starts with the leadership because they're typically the first ones there. But then it's like, how is this culture serving the ultimate goals for the company? And the reality is, for most companies, unless you're like a B Corp or how you're doing this, like it's to make money, right? And if you have investors, it's to return money to those investors. And so you need to think about like, how is this culture serving that? And then how are we all working together in a way, I think, that like maximizes our ability, our chance for success. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I've been on teams where they work all the time and everybody loves it. It's like not an issue. And like that was us in the early days. Like we had, like we were working hard, but we enjoyed every minute of it. And we, yes, but I think it attracts a certain type of person, right? Same with, I mean, this is just the most obvious example is like an in-person versus remote team, right? In person, forcing people to come into the office to commute, it like has an impact. But if you feel like you work better, like, and I think ultimately deciding what's a good culture is on the leadership team. And that's why I think it's so important for leadership team to at least have like the bare minimum conversations about the type of team they want to build and what team they think will execute best on their strategy and what some of those behaviors would be. This is something that I think is often, I guess one other quick example is like a really good mentor of mine. When we were like everything was going well at Proletariat. This was like midway through some of the Spellbreak stuff. We were like seeing awesome numbers in some of our early like alphas. And I remember telling him like, hey, like we're working like crazy. We're being super successful objectively, but morale is like low because we missed the last two deadlines. We're struggling. We're hurting with the like growth. Like the growth was just like really painful. And he said this to me, which gave me like his response to me was like, do you need good morale to be successful? And I was like, that is a like great and valid and important question, because this is all about what type of leaders what do the leaders want? Like what type of company, what type of team do the leaders want to make? And is it a requirement? No, like you don't need good morale to be successful. That's just a reality. Now, would I necessarily think you should have bad morale as a good way to be successful? No, I don't think it's that either. But they are decoupled, and I think it is what can work for one team doesn't necessarily work for another. And so some of it is, I think, figuring it out as you're building. And this is one of the things I think first-time founders really struggle with.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the type of culture that you want as a founder and as a founding team or as a leadership team, and then be a very non-negotiable about that. So that means that sometimes you have to forego really good talent that is just not fit for your culture. And I know that every company does this on a paper, but they kind of don't have that strong culture. So for example, again, I've never worked at Tesla or OpenAI or NVIDIA. They're known for a pretty brutal working culture, that they work 7 days a week because the CEO works 7 days a week. And they're pretty clear about that. And I think it's very clear that if you apply for those positions, that they are upfront with it, that this is not going to be a work-life balance. This is going to be your work phase of your life. And by being upfront of what type of a culture that the company has and wants to keep, allows people not to feel that the culture is bad when they enter it, because they have clear expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely changes this stuff. So a good friend of mine is a CEO of a game company. They're quite successful, independent studio, and he's like a real contrarian. So we have great conversations about this stuff because he has very strong feelings and has the success to back it up on all of this stuff. And so when we talk, it's really interesting. But so at his company, like there's no titles, and he like fervently pushes back on the idea of it and like makes it really clear as you're going through. And there is a certain type of person that cares about that. Like that is an important part of compensation for them. They feel like that's important to them building a career. And so that is a decision. It may seem like a small one, but saying like, hey, we don't care about titles here. There's no like structure in titles. And we actively push back against the idea of titles just makes, there are certain people that now would look at that and be like, oh, that would be a step back in my career, because for me, my career is like watching my LinkedIn increase in title. I need to go from like, from associate to mid-level to senior to lead to director or whatever. And if I don't do that, if I take a step back, I'm not willing to do that for my career. And so it just weeds out certain types of people that just wouldn't work there. And I think in some ways, this is one of those challenges that startups have, because often like beggars can't be choosers, because you're a brand new company, especially if you're a first time founder. You have like why would anyone trust you? You haven't raised yet. How are you attracting, like, but yet you're supposed to get the best talent that's out there. It's like, how do you possibly do that? Right. And I think in some ways you should make some decisions on the hiring side. Adding people to the culture is the way it gets established. I think, oftentimes the being thoughtful about this and checking in like every time you double the team size. We started with 5 founders at Proletariat, so we already had like a bigger team than normal. You could feel real changes in the company when we hit 10 people, when we hit 20 people, when we hit 50 people, when we hit 100 people. Like there were major shifts. And so I think starting to look at it that way of just, hey, let's check in on, are we making the right decisions for our team? And like, what are we allowing? What are we not allowing? How are we talking about this? How are we thinking about how the team is acting and behaving? How are they making decisions? And are we happy with that? And even just that conversation is enough to do like a cultural check-in and to maybe make some changes. Because I think if you're not seeing the right decisions be made, if you're not seeing the right behaviors, and you think those behaviors are leading to negatively impact the success of the company, then I think you have to have the culture conversation, whether or not you have product.
Not allowing is the hardest conversation. A lot of leaders, myself included, were not prepared to have that conversation where you basically set the rules. It's everybody wants to be loved and liked, and it's very hard to come in and say, "Hey, we don't do this. This is not okay." Especially on the areas that are not like blatantly wrong, but you just don't want to see that happening here. And when you interfere like that, it's not that people are like, "Oh, okay, so that's clear." You hit a lot of resistance, and those are very challenging places because you kind of let's say tough decisions, whether it is we work from the office. That's not like a good or bad decision. It is a strong decision, and there will be people who are very much upset against that decision. Or you would say we are apolitical. No pride, no Christmas, no Hanukkah, no, you name the holiday, you name, well, not religious, not political. You name a political, no,
Yeah,
make
this is the
America
Silicon
great
Valley.
again.
You're mission driven. You're mission
Yeah,
driven, right? No
exactly.
politics.
I forgot. Basecamp was that type of a company, and some other ones that are clearly apolitical. You can be political outside of it or religious or whatnot, but inside the office, you just do your work. Like that's a tough decision and hard to keep up, especially when the world is in different crises and people have very strong emotional positions and they want to bring it to the workplace naturally.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I think, yeah, like absolutely. The question you mentioned, the allow versus not allow, I think that when I've seen and I've talked to teams and watched as like when teams don't live their culture or when you see culture erode, I think it is mostly because doing what you talked about, like, is hard. It is hard to constantly have high standards. Like, and that's in everything. Like that is, hey, in this, like, so I'll give you an example from Proletariat. Like we had this cultural communication document that laid out like how you're supposed to use email, how you're supposed to use Slack, like, and we were kind of militant about it. Actually, we were very militant about it. And even things like we had an industry news thread, like an industry news channel in Slack. And that structure was meant to be like the link, and then any communication in the link needed to be in the thread. And people would occasionally, like new people or whatever, like whatever, people make a mistake. They're not really, they're using Slack on mobile. They're doing it quickly. Like they don't put it in the thread. Multiple people would chime in and be like, hey, thread this, please. And, or like, hey, you're not formatting your email properly. And that is uncomfortable. It's awkward. It's awkward to go tell someone, hey, it's like telling someone their flies down, right? It's like, hey, you made this like tiny mistake. I don't want to embarrass you, but like you should fix this. But that's exhausting. And so building that into your culture so that there is a discipline around that, I think allows you to build that up, because the way I've seen it go the opposite way is what you mentioned, which is it's not necessarily the wrong thing to let that go. It's the easy thing. And so the issue is because you're not doing the right thing and you're doing the easy thing over and over and over again, you have this slow erosion. Because instead of making the hard choice, which was the right one, you're doing the easy one, which wasn't explicitly wrong. Like it's not like someone was like ranting racist comments in the
yeah,
Slack. They just like didn't use the thread. But that slow erosion like will happen over time if you just continue to if you have a culture that is built up to do the easy thing. I think discipline is really important for some of that stuff. And so it may sound over the top, but I think it is. I think a lot of those little things do end up mattering, because if you make it a culture where, hey, it's no big deal, like you made a little mistake, just fix it. It's not a problem. Like we're not,
yeah.
then that spreads to other things. Like that spreads across from email to Slack to more important things. So
I've seen this happening in the companies, like when the war in Ukraine started. So people were like, okay, Ukraine, good, let's support that. Let's be on this side. So everybody agrees with it. But then you get more and more and more different wars happening. It's like, okay, which team do we root now? Because we've set the precedent that we choose one of the sides. So we have to choose now another one. Then let's choose another one, and that creates a chaos inside of the company, especially at a larger scale. So it's much easier to just focus on let's focus on ourselves. Let's not do anything extra. Let's, at work, we talk about work topics. Outside work topics, you can talk whatever. We're not, we don't want to control the way you think or the way you act. But here, we just focus on the work. So those are the kind of elements that are tricky, because you start with something that you feel is good and you're doing the right thing, and then it turns into a chaos over time because you've expanded your focus.
yeah, I mean, I think I think there's no one size fits all, because there are some companies that are where there are certain positions that really matter, and that they feel like deeply aligned with either the leadership or the company or whatever it is. And so, I think defining though clearly and then communicating that back out to your team. So so we generally stayed out of everything at Proletariat until when the George Floyd incident happened. We felt like we had to kind of speak up. And one thing we did is like I was very firm in, I didn't want us to just post a statement. Like, if we're going to do this, like, we need to like donate real money and like make a real impact. And I personally I never liked the idea of posting stuff publicly for Proletariat, because in some ways then you're speaking for everyone,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily fair, because maybe there are people there that have differing views on all these different topics. So I was much more comfortable saying, picking one thing and speaking for me and encouraging our team members, if you want to speak out on this, go ahead and do it. And then doing something like matching charitable donations made way more sense for me. But I think there's no one size fits all for it, but all of these things matter. Like that's the problem. And this is where I think some of your primary kind of concern in the beginning comes up, which is just like, man, it's so easy to get so distracted by all of these things, when really like finding product market fit is so hard.
Yeah, exactly.
And like by itself, like now you not only do you have to find product market fit, you have to hire the best people, and you have to, and you have to have great work-life balance, and you need to speak out on all of these other, and yeah, it's really hard. I think you have to pick and choose. You have to decide, like, are you, if you're going to focus on work-life balance, then you, like, that's going to be really difficult. Like that, like at least from my experience, like we weren't able to do it. Like we weren't able to have great work-life balance while building a company, the founders at Proletariat. And so like
which company has that? Like which company succeeded at that?
I mean, I'm sure there are some. I bet you there are some out there
I've never
that can
heard.
do it.
I've never heard of that.
I've seen people post about the fact of like, oh, I can still, spend time with my kids while building my $1 million startup, and maybe these are just thought pieces on LinkedIn.
As a solopreneur, sure,
yeah,
but maybe.
But I think I think that's part of the challenge, though, is like your most important job as a leader is allocating resources, and that can be both money or time. And so that's why like what I advocate for is like, I think by saying, I don't think you should spend a ton of time making merch and mugs and everything else for your company. We rarely did merch at Proletariat. We like pushed back pretty harshly on it. But on the other side of it, I think if you don't have some of these discussions, if you don't consciously talk about some of the decisions you're making, one, you could have different leaders be making different decisions, which I think can be a bit chaotic for the culture you're establishing. You can also not have a team that you want. Like maybe one team's making hiring decisions one way and one team's making hiring decisions the other way, and you don't notice right away because you're small and they're somewhat separate. But then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is a problem. Like we have director level people in one team that have 15 years of experience. We have director level people on another team that have 2 years of experience. And like now this is a problem. Now we may lose our great talent, 15-year directors, because they're like I want to be a VP, and you're like, no. And so ultimately it's the two key things I think are how the team works together and who you can get on the team.
Even easier example that I've seen happen is you are building a team for a mobile product, and let's say that's a high quality mobile product, and you're bringing in talent from AA and AAA studios. Their ways of working is drastically different than yours. And then you start seeing essentially a separation of the team and different ways of building a product that wasn't there when you started. And you kind of you might be even listening to the people coming in from the big studios, and it kind of makes sense. Oh, you worked at Blizzard. Oh, you worked at Activision. You must know about this. But they actually worked on totally different phases of the product and a total different platform and a total different stages. So those type of decisions can be very harmful in mid to long term, because you're bringing in people with absolutely different ways of working and different ways of looking what's good and what's not, because they're just not used to the platform.
Well, that's why, this is one of the areas that I think is incredibly important. I mean, our experience So when we were really scaling Proletariat, it was basically 2020. And we went from like 45 or 50 people to like 130 by the end of 2020.
Oof.
It was crazy. And
Remotely?
this is during COVID. Yeah. So we went full
Wow.
remote in March. And so then started doing it all remote. This is why I think like this is another area that I think teams don't think about. It's, when you're really small, there's like, oh, like as the CEO, you should like, take your new employee out to lunch when you're 10 or 15 people, in the first month. And it's like, and when you get bigger, every new hire that came in, you'll sit down and you'll do like new employee orientation. And I think so much of that misses the mark. Like, what is the cultural onboarding? Because what you're talking about is like these people from double or triple A or for whatever culture they just came from have a thought on the way work should be done from what they just went through. And then there's often so little direct, like maybe you get a buddy as you're onboarding or whatever it is, but like, what is the cultural onboarding to train people about how you work at this company? And so that's one of the things that we, like some of the stuff that we focused on in making the kind of core culture docs we had, which was like, we had this cultural communication document, which was like, this is how we write email at Proletariat. This is how we do meetings at Proletariat. This is how we use Slack at Proletariat. And the expectation is you will do it this way. And that wasn't saying that we weren't open to new ideas. We absolutely were. There were people that would come in and be like, hey, at Riot, we did things this way. We think it's really helpful. Like we should add this. So of course, like iterate on it like you would a product, but put in the work to culturally onboard these people. Cause it's so funny when people, get someone of like, oh, we hired this, CMO from AAA, but then they don't know how to do marketing and mobile. And it's like, well, there's a skill gap question of did you hire the wrong one? But then also, did you do anything to train them on like how different it is to be shipping every single Tuesday, in a mobile game versus shipping every 6 years in AAA? And there's a bunch of just the way things work. And I think like if teams spent a little bit more time, because often they're spending the time anyway, but they're spending the time getting to know someone or taking them out to lunch, which those things are all important. But when you think about like what's in an onboarding, new employee orientation is often like all HR stuff. But where is the actual like, here are some of the norms and behaviors we expect here. Here's what you can expect if, here's how we talk to each other. And we go into detail in ours where it's like, we started this before when we were in person. So it was like, hey, if someone has their headphones on, send them a Slack first. Don't walk over to their desk. Because like we valued heads down work because we had a large open office and it was distracting. And so, but like knowing that if you come from a culture where, hey, everything's a meeting, we talk things out in every meeting, we want long meetings, but like, that's not the way we do things here. Here, we want agendas. We want no surprises in meetings. We want them to be really tight and then train people on how to work here in this culture. And I think it doesn't have to be a ton of effort to do this, but I think you'll save a bunch of heartburn and time really being like, hey, there's a cultural onboarding here. When you come to our company, we do things a bit differently, and we're going to train you on how to do that so that you don't bump into these embarrassing things where you walk in and your fly is down and we have to tell you, like that kind of thing. You get over it really quickly and people can integrate really fast.
I 100% agree with you on a point that having a documented culture when you begin scaling really rapidly is essential because that allows you to have written rules on how to behave. It's more that just spending that time and writing the culture early on where you're not, when you're 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe under 30 people is really, I feel like at that point, your example and the example of your leadership team should be the one that drives the culture. But I wanted to ask you another question, and that is about, can you copy a culture? Because I've seen culture being copied very successfully. Like Supercell is a great example of literally copying Netflix's culture deck and just going through it. I think they've been very open about it and saying this is pretty much our culture. Like 80%, 85% of that became Supercell culture. And then I've seen countless of companies copy Supercell's culture. And I don't know if they've succeeded at copying the culture, but they definitely failed at being a successful company. So what's your take on copying a culture? You mentioned Creativity Inc. as well.
Well, I mean, I think you should absolutely steal stuff from these, if you find things that really resonate with the leadership team. And this is one of the things that I think is so important, just to touch quickly on the fact that we don't train leaders. We don't train managers really well at all. It's just like, also, it doesn't just stop still spend a good amount of my time, and even when I was still a VP at Blizzard, like listening to podcasts, reading books when they came out, because I just want to constantly get better as a leader and a manager.
Yeah.
And there are new states of the art, right? Like, you know, I remember when Radical Candor came out, and that was like the soup du jour, where everyone was talking about how important Radical Candor was. And like, again, that sort of direct feedback is in Creativity Inc., which was written, 15 years before Radical Candor. And so it's just like, it was a good way of framing it. It was a good reminder. You know, I still find myself almost every other year reading like How to Win Friends and Influence People, because there's a bunch of important things in that book, or like High Output Management. I probably reread every 5 years. And so I think you should absolutely steal. And I think this is one of those things where it's not a religion. Like you should be constantly iterating on it. You shouldn't stay static and be like, hey, this is the way we started at the beginning. This is meant to be a document that's edited. This is meant to be like something that is moved. And so I think as far as the second part of the question, like, I think this is where what we spent a good amount of time discussing before around the idea of like, is it the cultural ideas of Supercell just don't make sense today? Or is it that these people just didn't execute on those cultural ideas? And now that's even completely separate, because if they're still doing the wrong work in the Supercell way, right? Like, this is the high output management thing, right? Which is, you know, you can do all this work. You're running a breakfast factory, and you get down to the like highest profit, quickest time creation of a hard boiled egg. But if the customer comes up and orders toast, like, who cares?
Yeah.
And so all of that work doesn't matter. And so that would be the thing that I would try to decouple, is like, hey, the Supercell culture, I think, was put in place as a way to go and find product market fit really effectively. And it was also really determined on, did they have the right people to execute on that culture? Like, that's not an easy culture to make work.
I think now that I thought about it as you were speaking, I think the Netflix culture copying is easier because they were very transparent of what their culture is, and were actually given away the culture deck that anybody would get. And you can read a book about it. And as you said, copy freely and do copy, but you're copying it from the books, from the management books that are quite detailed. But what happened with Supercell is people saw the company's enormous success, small headcount, and PR posts by the CEO on like once a year in a blog post, which is
he'd
not
be like, I have the least power of any CEO, and it's like, I don't know if that's actually true, right? Like, that sounds like really good PR
people,
speak.
Exactly. And that's so I would say, like, I've met many of these companies. I'm like, have you actually talked to anybody who works at Supercell? It's like, no, but we really appreciate the blog posts. So I'm like, okay, you read 4 blog posts that came out throughout 4 years, and they are written with the CEO and public, PR professional to sound good, to read good, but they're actually more of a vision pieces that are tied to reality, but might not be, the actual reality. They don't take they don't maybe tell the full truth and the difficulties that comes through having this type of a culture. Like, they don't talk about the bad sides. They're like, oh yeah, it's sometimes a lot of work, but like, no, like, you have a brutal culture and you should be able to tell that. So I think the difference there is that if you copy elements of a culture, or even large portions of a culture, be sure that you're getting it from a clear source, whether you worked at the company or it's a management book, or you're really understanding what you're copying. But don't copy something that you don't know, you have a faint idea, and really what you're trying to do is you're copying the revenue and the EBITDA of that company. You're thinking that, hey, this is the way how they do it, so I'm just going to take whatever they say because they make so much money. So that means that this must be the right way to do things.
Well, I think there's a lot of like hidden things that you would get. I mean, when I think about, and it's been a while since I've read stuff on Supercell's culture, but a lot of it was like keeping teams really small, empowering them to make the decisions they would need to really make, and sort of like giving them the opportunity to decide, like, should we kill this game? Like, do we just not have the confidence that we can get this game to where it needs to be?
Celebrating killing of a game, which I never saw, but for surely happened. But didn't happen maybe
No
every
one,
time.
I mean, that to me is like, no one's like the celebrating failure stuff is, I mean, you should, I guess, be happy that but I can guarantee that if you look back at all those games, I think if they looked back in hindsight, they would realize that they actually saw signs sooner and they should have killed it sooner.
Yeah,
And so in
100%.
some ways, so like I think that maybe there's good learnings from that, which is to be celebrated, right? Every time you learn something, if it's like tangible, whether that's a team learning something or something else. But I think the way to look at this in my mind is, if you have a couple of cultures that you really like, say, the Netflix culture, or you look across, like there's tons of books now on different cultures, right? Like Zappos had some stuff for a long time. They had a really weird organizational structure. Like Valve has their
Yeah,
manifesto, I
Valve
think
is
you
a
can
famous
see,
one.
right? And Valve is also a very weird company. And now we're seeing all this stuff about NVIDIA and like the way Jensen operates with like, 80 direct reports and no one-on-ones and like no status updates. And it's like, is that really the way it works? Because like that's a good headline, but like how is it? And this is why when we came out of Zynga to do Proletariat, Zynga had like all of that PR stuff you could imagine, right? Like posters with the core values,
I
like every notebook
remember.
had the
I
core values,
remember.
and a couple of them. It's funny, I don't remember all of them, but the one that I do remember is Be the CEO, which I actually thought was like a great value. It was like, hey, everyone, like you are responsible. Like be the CEO and go make the change. Like take agency and fix it. And I thought that was something that actually was embodied, and you would hear that. You'd hear people say that, where and sometimes it would get misused, and it was like, oh, why did you cowboy this thing in? And it was like I was being the CEO. But I
Yeah.
think in some ways, though, if you're in a like they were going for a culture that was maximum agency, moving quickly as possible to continue to accelerate and grow. And so we came out of the Zynga experience and we got a chance to look at this and be like, hey, we've just seen what they say the culture is, but we've also lived what it actually was.
Yeah,
So when we
which is
look at this,
different.
like, what do we think? What are the important things here that we think worked? Like, what resonated? What didn't resonate? How did this all work? And so I think I would not trust a like a team saying they're going to replicate Supercell's culture unless they have several leaders who were in Supercell's culture, ideally early, and have like
Yeah.
lived it and can tell you what worked and what didn't. Because Supercell has not always been, Supercell got really big, but I wouldn't say it's like been straight up and to the right. Like they've had plenty of missteps in terms of like the products they built and everything like that. And
Yeah.
so I would really want to hear like, hey, and this is something that I would do with some of the senior leadership when we would start to bring them in from other places. Is I would just ask them like, what would you want to keep from your team at your previous company, and what would you want to change? And just like
Yeah.
hear from them, like, can they clearly articulate what was working and what wasn't?
Companies go through phases, and you're absolutely right. Like there are people who come in at later phases, and and at that point, it is a totally different company. And then again, people who are in the early phases live throughout, like they worked in a different company. And then I like how Netflix did it in their book. At least they tell that they essentially let go people who are good for a certain phase, and they're like, you were a builder, you're incredibly valuable. This company has now grown to a stage where you don't like it here, and it's your effort is much better suited for a company of that size. So here's a generous package, and thank you so much for helping us and so forth. So yeah, I 100% agree of really understanding of what you're copying. And when you mentioned Zynga, I thought about like my favorite culture was the culture that we had at our Fun Plus studio. So I think over 80% of us came from Zynga. So I left and brought more and more people throughout the time, and mainly Zynga was the biggest studio and the only studio that I worked in San Francisco. So it was very easy to attract talent from there. And our culture was essentially counterculture of what Zynga had at that point. It wasn't going through the best years. It was the terminless, 3 different CEOs in 2 years and that kind of stuff. And everybody knew it, and everybody left because of that. And we just essentially were like, let's just not do it the way Zynga does it. And the culture was beautiful. Like, for example, instead of doing like these long documents on design and reviewing them in multiple ways, we're like, let's just stand in front of the whiteboard and discuss what we're going to do. and then commit to it and do it. And it worked perfectly. And people were happy because they knew the ultra that they hated, the back and forth, the long documents, the time you spend on planning versus the time you spend in doing and iterating software.
But those, I think, like, that's the type of decision that even if you're not, even as a small team, you don't need to spend a ton of time writing up all these like culture documents and things like that. But you just be like, hey, I mean, when you think about some of the most extreme ones you hear about, right? It's like, no PowerPoint decks at Amazon. It's only like the 5.55
6 pages
or whatever it is.
6 pages, yeah.
And so, like, but there's when you think about just what is the behavior that drives, like, okay, well, so there was definitely a culture that, it's even when I was there, on like the level of detail in PowerPoint decks, the amount of time and effort that was spent to make them look nice. And there was a real question of just like, is that valuable? Like, do we, is that the type of thing we want people to be focused on? And versus like, hey, we want to get in front of a whiteboard and we want to like tear up ideas. So that's the way we want to run things. And I think treating it as looking across this as a buffet and being like, how do you want to fill your plate? When I was at Zynga, some of the things that were really good is it was a very results oriented culture. Like it was actually pretty non-political, at least from where I was sitting. It felt very non-political because it was just like very empirical in terms of results. You could like very easily see what was working and what wasn't. And there was like a lot driven on that. Now there's no right or wrong culture. It's just like something that I thought was effective at the time. And so it was effective that it was very results oriented. And it kind of, was that created a certain culture of like, hey, you had accountability in terms of like, this is what we care about, our results. And then it also had a really great culture of transparency across the product org specifically. Like the product org itself had great level of like knowledge sharing and a bunch of work in like training people up and getting people like some of the best I've ever seen, honestly, in terms of bringing people in from outside of games, ramping them up, training programs, like very rigorous on how they would train them. And I thought that was really impressive. Now, there were other parts of the culture that I don't think worked, but looking at this and being able to piece together, hey, like, what do we think is going to work for us in the way we all work as people and the types of things we want to do? And a small team that's trying to do a Supercell thing is very different than if you want to build a AAA game, like, what we were doing with Proletariat, where we're getting to like hundreds of people, or what I was doing previous to this at World of Warcraft, where you're like 700, like you're these massive teams. And so that's like, those things are just like by their nature, they're just very different in terms of how they can operate because of just the things they need to do. But those behaviors, I think, are important. And starting, like, I think you can chip away at this pretty quickly, like as things come up. Like you don't need to dedicate the first 6 months of your startup to figuring out your culture, but just each time you're like, man, we're sitting in this meeting and this, the person put together a PowerPoint deck, but they said they spent 2 days just making it pretty. It's like, all right, no more of that. Like, we're not doing that anymore. And so like starting to just keep this stuff in mind, these decisions, like finding a way to sort of log them, to write them down, so that then everyone can now know this. You can spread it across, I think, is a way to be thoughtful about like, why do we make this decision? It's like our internal discussions are about we want to talk about the facts. We don't want to talk about anything else. So all we care about is the facts and the data. You don't need to make it pretty. You don't need to make it good looking, whatever. Like that's what we care about in here. That's where we want you to spend your time. Like that's what communicating no pretty decks means, I think, in the way it would actually play out. And maybe that's what you want. So
yeah, I agree. And overall, like I'm getting the feeling that you're very much in favor of adaptive culture, like a strong and adaptive culture, rather than this rigid culture that becomes a liability as you scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think very much. I think I think you should be, the best advice I can give on the culture side is to be thoughtful about it in terms of like when these moments happen, to just talk about like, what do we think is like what occurs here, and then be adaptive, but also like check in on it. If you have, not everything is very easy to tell via metrics, but at the end of the day, people are people and your leadership team is making decisions. So those decisions are going to be driven by, hey, do the leaders think that the team is operating the way it should be? Whether or not it is, perception is reality in a lot of these things. And so even just asking that, just checking in on that periodically and being like, is the culture serving what we want? And is it because we have the wrong culture? Is it because we have the wrong execution of the culture? Are we allowing too many things that we said we wouldn't allow? And I think those types of conversations are really valuable to just keep things on track. And again, this doesn't guarantee success. Like that's the frustrating part. But I think if you're not doing this, I think it can be much harder to actually be successful, because you'll pay it off eventually. Like the debt will build up, and whether you pay that off after you hit massive product market fit and you need to kind of do a full reboot of the culture, like an Uber story,
Mm-hmm.
or you can handle it on the go as you're evolving, is sort of an open question, I think.
I want to ask you two more questions. So I'll start with the harder one, and that is what what's one belief about company cultures that you've changed your mind about in the past years? I know you said you read a lot of books, read a lot of podcasts. So what has changed, especially during the time away from Blizzard, where you're not day to day and you can actually reflect and think?
I think the biggest thing that I've sort of changed my mind on is that you can't directly influence the culture. Like for a long time, it was like, oh, these are just the unwritten rules. Like it's really hard to do that. I think that's the biggest thing that I've come around on, is like, no, you can. And you now that creates its own culture in itself by like being rigorous about it, the way we were with like, hey, here is the cultural onboarding document for the company. And so I think the 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 fact that it's just, because I remember when we were starting Proletariat, it was like, yeah, we'll have some core values, but like culture is really just about the people you hire. And like that's true, but that's saying that you can't change it or influence it. And I think you absolutely can. So I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned maybe over my time, is that you can have influence over it, and that it is something that is easier to influence than you might think.
Last question, that is the easiest one. How did you come up with the name Proletariat? That's a very Marxist term.
Yeah, I mean, so there were kind of two reasons. One is like we happened to have one of the founders had proletariat.com as a domain name, which was nice. But also we had, we were talking about different names, and at the time, the five founders, like we felt like we were the working class of the game industry. Like, I started as an engineer and designer. All of us were having, we all got like C-level titles or VP level titles or whatever, director level titles, but we felt like we were still the working class, and like that was what we wanted, and I think this was maybe a little bit of an overreaction or response to our experience at Zynga, where it felt like in the lead up to the IPO, Zynga was just like stuffing the ranks with tons of executives that would just like pop in at times, and we were sort of like, what are they doing? Like they're not in the trenches. And so
Yeah.
we felt like we were the working class of the game industry, and that was and that was what we wanted to keep it that way. So even for the first game at Proletariat, I wrote a ton of code, like a lot, basically like a full-time engineer. After that, I couldn't really. I was still very involved on like the product and design sides through all of our products, but I was never just like only an executive, like kind of just managing people. I was always like very hands-on with the products that we made. And I think we even brought that to when we started to get to like second and third level management tiers at like hundreds of 100 people or whatever, where we would embrace people that wanted to be like operating managers. Like they wanted to still write code half the time, but also manage a couple of people. And we fully, like, we wanted to allow people to do that and be thoughtful on how we would approach it. That's the longer answer. The short answer is like, we thought it was a cool name and we had the domain name, which was also helpful. But I will say I love the name, but man, no one could spell it. So the one funny story I'll give you is you had to get this like Dun and Bradstreet number in order to get an Apple developer account, which was just like proving that you're a company. And they
Mm-hmm.
spelled our name wrong on it. And it took me like weeks to get someone on the phone to eventually change it, because they spelled the company Proletariat with two P's. And so, yeah, anyway.
Well said. It was a pleasure talking about a difficult topic. My brain held. I had actually a red eye flight before my flight was delayed. I came at 3 a.m. yesterday. So it was a pleasure discussing this, because like there's not the right way to do things, and I think you open up it really clearly and give a lot of examples and teach people to adapt their culture based on where they're going, to learn from others, and to manage it as a product rather than as something that is intangible, invisible, and a gravity on its own. So I think it's a really, really interesting way. And I think it's a very good way for many companies to think about how they build their culture so that they can scale efficiently and not lose the control of the company and not end up in a company that they founded but is now totally different than what they would like to actually work in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the chance to talk about this. I think definitely inside of the game industry, but I think overall across every organization, like I would love to see people get better as leaders and managers and create better functioning teams. And so for whatever that means to them in terms of the culture, like people to find a culture they want to work in. So I'm all for trying to provide any tools I can give, and any of the scars that I've earned from the experience of making lots of mistakes in doing this. Right?
Yeah, and for that, there's a link in the description for your Substack, Boss Battles. Tough one to find on Google, by the way.
I'm sure. Yeah.
There's plenty of boss battles and gaming blogs, but use the link in the description below. Subscribe to Seth's blog, and would love to have you back when you begin your next adventure.
Cool. Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for listening.
You did it. You made it to the end of the episode. As a fan of the show, it would help us out if you'd subscribe and leave us a review on the podcast service of your choice. Those stars and likes, while a small action on your part, mean a lot to us and help to grow the show. More importantly, are you a member of the Deconstructor of Fun Slack group? If you have 5 years or more of games industry experience, go to deconstructoroffun.com/Slack and apply to join. Join the games industry best professional community filled with peers always willing to lend a hand, or subscribe to our newsletter to get all the latest insights from the Deconstructor of Fun content creators. Thanks for listening.